if you're wondering why we acted here, we're not acting here, and we did act in Libya, Iraq, etc., look, there are obvious geopolitical reasons, right? It doesn't mean that we're definitely not going to act. It doesn't necessarily dictate how we should act. So let me give you the two examples, right? So in Libya, we had atrocities. Were they at this level? I don't know that anything's been at this level, right? But Libya has a lot of oil. And so France, for example, did not have good oil contracts in Libya. This is real. This is real. This is how people make decisions, okay? This is how countries make decisions. They would have benefited from an upheaval in Libya where they would have redone the oil contracts, which is, by the way, exactly what happened. And after the war, France got much better oil contracts, to my understanding. So, and the countries that had better contracts with Libya were not as interested in war, including Turkey in the beginning. Later, Turkey switched over to the other side and said that it had gone too far. In this case, Erdogan, the leader of Turkey, also making very strong statements about Syria, saying that at some point the UN must act, and that point is coming fairly soon. Now, Syria doesn't have any oil. So, tick-tock, 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 babies are killed, no action. Now, we've already acted in Libya, so then people say, hey, you know what, can we really stand for another Middle Eastern war? Well, that's a fair question, especially when you look at the second example, Iraq, right? Iraq was a country we invaded based on far, far, far less. There was none of this going on presently. Anything that had happened that Saddam Hussein had done terrible had happened over a decade ago, right? But we said, oh my God, what if he were to do something in the future and attack that country? Iraq has oil. Now, there's a third angle here. Syria has, you know, a relationship with Israel that's really not spoken of much. It's theoretically hostile, but in reality, perfectly friendly when it comes to the two regimes. They don't bother Israel at all. So now that's the devil we know. Doesn't mean it's that Israel thinks Assad is a good guy. They don't, right? But that's a devil that they not only know, but already had to deal with. Now you bring in somebody else, you bring in a democracy. As they saw in Egypt, maybe the democracy isn't as pro-Israel as the current autocratic regime. So that complicates the issue. So how do you go forward? Now look, last thing on this. Syria is very confusing in terms of what we should do and not do. Nobody wants to commit ground troops to another messy war in the Middle East. And who do you want to put in power? It's a tough situation. It involves perhaps even more lives lost if you intervene. And once you get into the middle of the muck, then things get more confusing as to who's on which side. So those are the downsides of going into Syria. Could we do some sort of aerial bombing as we did in Libya? Possibly, right? But one other thing that complicates it is the fact that our government is so stridently anti-Iran. Now, Syria, at least the government, is friendly with Iran, so that makes us more likely to go into Syria. But on the other hand, we don't want to go into Syria because what we really want to do is go into Iran. Now, Iran, one, is developing nuclear energy, not necessarily weapons. In fact, every intelligence agency says they have no nuclear weapons or the capacity to make nuclear weapons at this point. But we want to go to Iran. One, because we want to head that off, presumably. Number two, Iran has oil. Syria doesn't have oil. So all the propaganda that you hear in the United States is revolving around how dangerous Iran is, how we've got to act, how we've got to do something about Iran. Now, Iran has mistreated its own citizens as well. They had a fraud of an election. The leaders of Iran do not represent the people of Iran, right? But they have had nothing of the scale that has happened in Syria, with murdered children and women, 9,000 dead overall since the uprising began, just absolute massacres by the Syrian government. But the propaganda in the United States every day is about how terrible Iran is and how Syria is a complicated situation. Now, the latter is right, it is complicated. But you cannot tell me, and this is the one thing that is absolutely clear, you cannot tell me that we should consider bombing Iran, but that we should not consider bombing Syria. That somehow the Iranian government is more dangerous and more lethal and more gruesome than the Syrian government. No, you can tell me about geopolitical considerations. You can tell me about oil. You can tell me about Israel. You can tell me about other concerns. And that's keeping it real. But if you pretend that somehow Iran poses a greater danger to its own citizens or to the world than Syria does, well, that is indefensible.